You see, after 12 months of the war, has Israel met its objectives? You haven't secured the release of your hostages, but you haven't even defeated Hamas.
This is a leader who was quite deeply unpopular even before, events of October 7th occurred the way they did. There was growing discomfort around this man being, the leader of the Israeli government.
If you look at how Hezbollah has been functioning ever since the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, I think the argument that Hezbollah has been completely destroyed doesn't hold currency because Hezbollah is still a fighting force. What India is trying to do is that India is trying to maintain a middle position. The Chinese are much more vocal when it comes to criticizing Israel, but India doesn't do that. But India says that the government supports the creation of a Palestinian state.
Most of the beginning of this century has been defined by US's desire for control and power, and I guess that plays out in every single major war that we see. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the India Dialogue. I believe we're at episode 31. We're grateful that you're listening to us. My name is Ruchir. I'm joined by my co-host Mitali. Manu is missing in action even this week, but we have a guest, Stanley Johnny, who I will introduce in a moment. Mitali, as you know, is the acting director at the Reuters Institute and has written a book on crypto crimes and is known for her time at CNBC. And Ruchir, I'm CEO at Distributed Energy and chair at School of Policy and Governance. And we're joined by a special guest today, Stanley Johnny, who is the foreign affairs editor at The Hindu and has written a book titled The Comrades and the Mullahs and ISIS Caliphate. Stanley's presence will indicate what we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss West Asia. But just before I dive in, the India Dialogue is primarily about trying to cover issues that matter to India in depth. We cover stories every week. Sometimes we go outside India to try and look at what matters in the world and where does India fit in. And so today I'll ask Mitali to set the scene for the current crisis with Israel, Palestine, Iran, all the actors. I'm sure it's a very complex scene to set, but Mitali, why just try to set the scene and then we can interrogate Stanley.
Yeah, thanks for that. And again, we're sort of missing our third man at the pitch, which is Manu, and hopefully he's going to be back next week. And I think you sort of set the context yourself really well, Ruchir, which is that there is so much complexity to what we are going to discuss that I first want to say two things. One is that our attempt over here is not to either build a narrative or to sort of, pick a side, because that's the one thing that the India Dialogue is not about. What we're trying to meet is this need for greater nuance, for greater understanding, just for greater context, and that's where we're at. And the second point is that we're sort of, and I'll explain that, we're having this conversation around the time when events really started escalating around the region. So it's highly emotive. There's a lot of information out there, and we sort of completely understand and empathize the positions that people have. And our attempt over here is just to build a little bit more of an understanding on how India sees this, how India could be affected by it, and really where things stand. Stanley, as you know, is literally the best person to be doing that. So I will start with just a little bit of a placeholder in terms of where things have gotten to in the last 1 year. As you've probably seen and saw in the news, on the 7th of October last year, the Palestinian militant group Hamas launched an assault on Israel. By the numbers that we have from the Israeli government, about 1,200 people were killed, as we understand it. 250 were taken to Gaza as hostages. Some of them still remain in that region as hostages, with no clarity on whether they are alive anymore and what the prospects are for them to be returned and freed. In retaliation, Israeli military entered Gaza, attacked Gaza. At this point, the numbers, which are clearly all over the place, total it at more than 33,000 Palestinians in Gaza that have been killed. There's scores that have been displaced. And over the course of the last few months, events have really sort of erupted beyond that region into the neighboring region, Iran, Lebanon, all of it. Stanley, it's so great to have you, because I think the first thing for all of us that are trying to look at this is to get a sense of proportionality, to the event, to what its ramifications are, and to what it has escalated to at this point. Why don't you walk us through sort of just this last year and your sense of how things have blown up, really?
First of all, thanks Ruchir and Mitali for having me here. And yeah, you have already set the context. So if you look at the escalation or the proportionality of the conflict, I mean, as you laid out the numbers, it's evident what kind of war Israel is fighting on Gaza. It is not a counter-terror operation, because Israel is went to Gaza to fight Hamas, and Israel has set two objectives for themselves. One is to destroy Hamas. Netanyahu said that his forces will crush Hamas. And then the IDF also wants to secure the release of the hostages. So originally 250 people were taken by Hamas, of which more than 100 people were released when there was a brief ceasefire between Hamas and Israel in November 2023. And rest of them, more than 100 are still in Gaza, and a majority of them are believed to be dead. So this is the situation in Gaza. And see, Gaza is now, you go look at the UN numbers, roughly 60 to 80% of Gaza's buildings have been demolished. So it is now uninhabitable. Even before this is a tiny strip of land, 350 square kilometers, sandwiched between Israel proper and the Mediterranean Sea and Egypt on the one side, on the in the South Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula. And Gaza had been under Israeli blockade since 2007. So Israel was practically deciding what goes inside, what comes out of Gaza. And since October 2023, this has been besieged by the Israeli forces. So Israel decides even the number of aid trucks, going into Gaza. So this is the situation, and almost the entire population of Gaza, which is 2.3 million people, have been displaced. Almost the entire population. They are living in UN camps, makeshift shelters, etc., etc. And these shelters are also being bombed. And you look at the numbers, 41,000 people were killed and 100,000 people have been injured in 12 months. That also shows the kind of war Israel is fighting in Gaza. But what led to the escalation, even after using this kind of firepower? And this firepower is not entirely surprising for two reasons. One, the October 7 attack itself was the largest attack in Israel's history that is taking place in Israel proper since 1948. So the last time foreign troops came into Israel proper and fought or killed Israelis was when the state of Israel was created in historical Palestine in 1948. So, and also of the people, 1,200 people were killed, and of which vast majority of them were civilians. So Israel was in shock. Israel was wounded, and also, Netanyahu was clearly under pressure, because Netanyahu was the prime minister who promised security, and the largest attack in Israel's history unfolded on his watch. So he goes into Gaza with full force. He declares an all-out war, and he says that he will fight until he secures total victory. That's what he says. But you see, after 12 months of the war, has Israel met its objectives? It hasn't. Israel has managed to turn the whole of Gaza into a pile of rubble, yes. But, on the first anniversary of the Hamas attack, October 7th, 2024, Hamas launched dozens of rockets into Tel Aviv from Gaza, from the same besieged, bombed out Gaza. So, which means even after fighting for 12 months in a besieged enclave, you haven't secured the release of your hostages, but you haven't even defeated Hamas. And on the other side, what happened was that on October 8th, Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, opened a support front from southern Lebanon. He started firing rockets into Israel. So Hassan Nasrallah said, what he said was that, Hezbollah will stop firing rockets into Israel only if Israel ceases fire in Gaza. But Israel cannot cease fire in Gaza because they were not meeting their declared objectives. Forget about their undeclared objectives. There could be many people, if you analyze the situation, Israel wanted to re-establish its deterrence. Probably Israel wants to push Palestinians out of Gaza, more Palestinians. So there could be a lot of undeclared objectives, but they were not even meeting their declared objectives. So without meeting those objectives, Israel cannot stop the war in Gaza. And if they do that, Netanyahu's government will collapse because his allies had clearly said that if you are going to reach a ceasefire deal with Hamas, we are out. If they are out, his government will fall. So Netanyahu was kind of caught in a very difficult situation here. He can't stop the fighting in Gaza. He's not meeting his objectives in Gaza, but he has a security problem in Lebanon. Hezbollah keeps firing rockets. So then he decided to escalate the war. And what Netanyahu, when he looks at the conflict, what my understanding is that he sees the common link is Iran. So Iran is backing Hamas, Iran is backing Hezbollah. So Netanyahu thinks that he wants the United States to get involved itself in this conflict in a much more in a greater way or directly. So it was Israel that took the war to Iran. It's not the other way around. Because on April 1st, 2024, it was Israel that bombed Iran's embassy in Damascus. And then Iran responds to the Israeli bombing of the embassy. On April the 14th, Iran launches a barrage of drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles towards Israel, most of which were shot down, thanks to the Americans, because the Americans had set up a defensive coalition, including the US, the UK, the French, the Jordanians, and the Israelis, and they shot down most of the Iranian projectiles. But, the interesting point here is that Israel, when it went to the war in Gaza, it was, basically Netanyahu took the war to Iran in April, and then Iran retaliated, and then Israel had a symbolic attack inside Iran, and then both sides kind of, stepped back from the brink. But then on July 31st, Israel will hit Iran again. When Ismail Haniyeh was there in Iran to attend the Iranian president's Pezeshkian's inaugural ceremony, Israelis will kill the Hamas chief inside Tehran, right? And Iran did not retaliate. Iran said it would retaliate, but Iran did not retaliate. So this was the time when Israel would escalate the conflict with Hezbollah also, because Hezbollah, the problem was becoming uncontrollable in Israel's north. I was in Israel's north after the war broke out. So the situation there in Israel, especially in the Upper Galilee region, the anti-government sentiments were pretty strong because people were driven out of their homes because of the rockets, and the Israelis were also, they were also scared of Hamas-style attack from across the Lebanese border by Hezbollah. So the government pushed some 70,000 people out of the Upper Galilee region, and these people wanted to go back to their homes, and they were also putting pressure on the government. So Netanyahu cannot end the war in Gaza, but he wanted to send the displaced people back to northern Israel. So what he decided was that, or probably the way out he saw was that an escalated conflict with Hezbollah, Hamas, as well as Iran, with greater involvement from the United States. So that's why he took the war first to Iran, and then he decided to step up the war with Israel in the north. So, and then Hezbollah, interestingly, Hezbollah's rocket attacks were that Hezbollah, it is now, after Israel launched the direct invasion of Lebanon, that Hezbollah has stepped up its rocket barrages, because today 50 rockets were fired, yesterday 60 to 90 rockets were fired, and after Nasrallah was killed, Hassan Nasrallah was killed, Hezbollah had fired more than 1,000 rockets into Israel. So many people believe that Nasrallah's killing, the decapitation, had substantially weakened Hezbollah. But if you look at the number of rockets Hezbollah is firing, it is actually the other way around. When Nasrallah decided to fire rockets into Israel, he was fighting a controlled aggression in the north. But now this is war. This is an uncontrolled fight between Hezbollah and Israel. So this is how, I mean, if you look at the escalation cycle, this is how the crisis which actually broke out with Hamas's attack and Israel's retaliatory war in October 2023 is now standing on the brink of an all-out regional war, if it hasn't already become a regional war.
Stanley, can I ask two questions? One is you touched on it a little bit, but it went from destroying Gaza and Hamas to focusing on Hezbollah, and you said they felt threatened by Hezbollah doing a Hamas-style attack. What like were there visible signs of that? Like, why did they go so aggressive from Hamas to Hezbollah? That's the first question. Second is Hezbollah now virtually destroyed given the death of the leader? I was told that there was $800 billion. Was it 800 billion? No, $8 billion or some very large amount of money that was hidden with the Hezbollah leader. Is Hezbollah virtually destroyed now based on Israel's actions?
Yeah. Um, if I answer the first question, I think why Netanyahu decided to go, with full force against Hezbollah was mainly because he was under pressure because of Hezbollah's rockets from the north, and his objective of destroying Hamas had not been met. But the Israelis believe that Hamas's military capabilities have been degraded, at least the fighting capabilities. May not be the rocket attacks, or Hamas is still controlling parts of Gaza. They are not completely driven out of Gaza, but still their fighting capabilities have been degraded. And in the north, Hezbollah continued to pose security challenges to Israel. And Netanyahu was also under pressure because the residents wanted to go back to their homes in northern Israel. So he decided to basically, go aggressively against Hezbollah. You should also look at the brief context, because when Netanyahu, or when the IDF killed Fawad Shukr, who was a senior Hezbollah commander, who was also a right-hand man of Hassan Nasrallah, on April 31st, and then immediately after that, the Israelis killed Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Both happened within hours. So one attack took place in Beirut and the other was in Tehran, and it killed one Hezbollah commander, one Hamas commander, and the second attack was in Tehran. So basically the Israelis hit Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas within a matter of few hours on July 31st. But then after that, nobody responded. Like the Iranians threatened retaliation, they did nothing. Instead, what the Iranians said that they would not launch a retaliatory attack on Israel if Israel agrees to a ceasefire in Gaza. Hezbollah threatened retaliation, but what Nasrallah did was to fire some 200 plus rockets, most of which were shot down by the Israelis. So Netanyahu saw, an opportunity in the reluctance of his rivals, both Hezbollah and Iran. There was this high decibel rhetoric. Hezbollah was ready to fight a limited war, but the Israelis sensed that neither the Iranians nor Hezbollah were ready to fight an all-out war. But at the same time, he was also facing this ongoing security challenge from Israel's north. So Hezbollah wanted to fight a limited war, but Netanyahu here decided to go with full force punches. So first, they detonate the pages, then the walkie-talkies, then waves of massive bombings in Beirut, taking out Hezbollah senior commanders, and then they went after Hassan Nasrallah himself. Of course, Israel's calculation is that, this is a bottom-up approach, right? Because the walkie-talkies and the pagers target ground-level operatives. And then the bombings target the commanders. And then you take out the top of Hezbollah. So, of course, the military assessment, in my view, is that the Israelis think that this would substantially weaken Hezbollah. That also takes us to your second question. And then immediately after that, the Israelis launched their military invasion of Lebanon. So there is a clear pattern, right? You degrade the organization using airstrikes or pager detonations, etc., etc., and then you launch a ground invasion. And this is the fourth time Israel launches a ground invasion of Lebanon. They did that in 1978, they did that in 1982, they did that in 2006, and they did that in 2024, right? And on the past three occasions, it did not turn out to be well for Israel. 1978, Israel wanted to push the PLO out of the Litani River to the north of the Litani River in Lebanon, but the PLO would come back to the south of the Litani River. So that in 1982, Israel would launch another invasion of Lebanon. This time they wanted to push the PLO out of Lebanon. And they managed to force the PLO to relocate from Lebanon in 1982. But the war would lead to the rise of Hezbollah, which turned out to be which turned out to be stronger or whatever than the PLO itself. And in 2006, Israel would go to destroy Hezbollah's military capabilities, and they will fight for 30 days. And after 30 days of fighting, Israel had to accept a ceasefire and pull back from Lebanon, leaving Hezbollah where it was. So this is what the history of the conflict, Lebanon conflict, also tells us. So this time, Israel goes for a massive operation, targeting ground level operatives, etc., etc. But then, what happens ever since? See, the ground invasion started, I think, almost 10 days ago. So even now, Israel still hasn't broken through the initial defensive lines of Hezbollah. Israel has also taken dozens of casualties, confirmed casualties, right? Israel says that they have killed hundreds of Hezbollah fighters, but unlike in Gaza, IDF has also confirmed that they have taken casualties. Note that in the ground operation, IDF might make gains because, initially what the IDF said is going to be a limited incursion into Lebanon, but now this is looks like a full-fledged invasion of Lebanon because Israel has sent multiple reinforcements into Lebanon since the initial incursion took place. And then not just that, what we have to look at is that Hezbollah has stepped up the rocket attacks into Israel. A bigger question which Israel faces, a security question which Israel faces is that how are they going to stop Hezbollah from firing rockets? Because if Hezbollah's military capabilities have been degraded completely, like many claimed immediately after Hassan Nasrallah was killed, and I have to add this, the killing of Nasrallah is clearly a massive setback for Hezbollah, there is no doubt about it. There is no doubt about it. Because Nasrallah was one of the most important figures in Iran's axis of resistance, and Nasrallah was the most charismatic leader of Hezbollah for the last 3 decades. So it is a clear setback for Hezbollah. But if you look at how Hezbollah has been functioning ever since the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, I think the argument that Hezbollah has been completely destroyed doesn't hold currency because Hezbollah is still a fighting force. And Hezbollah continues to fire rockets, dozens of rockets, and those rockets breach Israel's military defense system. That's what happened in the north, where 2 civilians were killed yesterday. This was the first time Israeli civilians were killed by Hezbollah's rocket fire since the Lebanon invasion began. So I think this is going to go on for quite some time. This is not going to be over anytime soon. Or if I put the Gaza context, if even after 12 months of fighting, Israel hasn't completely defeated Hamas in a besieged enclave called Gaza, how are they going to defeat Hezbollah in Lebanon?
So many questions, Stanley, but I'll try and sort of limit them to a few. I guess, this is a good point to pivot to where India fits into this, especially given the context that this is a leader who was quite deeply unpopular even before, events of October 7th occurred the way they did. There were nationwide protests around the Supreme Court, changes that he wanted to bring in. There was growing discomfort around this man being, the leader of the Israeli government. How would you say India has approached both the leader and the event so far? And I guess a second question to that is, um, how how do you think, I'm trying to frame this correctly, but how informed do you think the average Indian reader or audience is at this point? Because it was at one point it was a bit insane on social media where there would be posts by the Israeli government, and the top 20 posts in reply to that would be in Hindi. So there's always been this sort of this macho state comparison, saying strong state Israel, strong state India. But do you feel, given the kind of media coverage there is so far, the average Indian has a good handle on what exactly is happening and how India is approaching it?
So when it comes to India's approach, so you can see that immediately after the October 7 attack happened, Prime Minister Modi had tweeted, declaring solidarity with Israel and condemning the terror attack, right? Which led to some debate in India's strategic circles, debate about whether India's position towards Israel and Palestine had completely undergone changes, etc., etc. But then you can see that a few days later, the MEA would come up with a statement saying that the MEA would condemn the attack, Hamas attack, but then also repeating India's traditional position that India supports, the creation of an independent sovereign Palestine state. And then ever since, you see India's voting records. You can look at India's voting records at the UN General Assembly. I think there were 6 votes in the UN General Assembly since the war began. So of which the first vote India abstained because it called for a ceasefire. Because India initially did not support the call for a ceasefire. And then there were 4 votes which India voted in favor of them. So where you can see that India was actually aligning more with its traditional position, because in one resolution, India voted in favor of a resolution that condemned Israel's settlements in the West Bank, because India's position is that Indian government supports the two-state solution. And if you support the two-state solution, you cannot have the illegal settlements in the West Bank, right? So here India condemns the settlements in the West Bank. And there was, on the second resolution, India votes in favor of a resolution that condemns Israel's continuing occupation of Syria's Golan Heights. And the resolution actually asks Israel to vacate the Golan Heights. And the third resolution, India supports the Palestinian right for self-determination. And in another resolution, the fourth resolution, India actually supported the resolution that called for a ceasefire in Gaza. So you can see that initially we, in a sense, the government of India declared solidarity with the Israelis who were attacked on October 7. And then Indian government was not very keen to support the initial resolution that called for a ceasefire in Gaza at the initial stage of the war. But then you can see India taking positions that aligned more or less with the positions of the global south, that condemns the settlements, that calls for a ceasefire, that supports the Palestinian self-determination. But then recently, in another resolution, again, India abstained, that called for the enforcement of the UN ruling, which practically asked Israel to end the occupation. So India believes that you cannot actually give timelines, but India says that we support the two-state solution. So this is, if you analyze this position, what India is trying to do is that India is trying to maintain a middle position, right? So you look at the External Affairs Minister's statements. External Affairs Minister said that what happened on October 7th was unmistakably a terror attack. That's what he said, and India condemns that. But at the same time, he says a solution is practically, should address the Palestine question. So if I quote Jaishankar, what he said, that at the end of the day, the problem is that the Palestinians are denied of their statehood. This is what he said. And he also says that Israel should have been careful or mindful of the human casualties, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So you can see that India doesn't basically condemn Israel's way of war, or the civilian or the number of people getting killed in Gaza, etc., etc. But at the same time, India tries to maintain a middle line in this conflict by declaring support for the Palestinian cause, while at the same time not taking any strong moral position, like, for example, South Africa is taking. Other countries in the global south are taking. Even the Chinese are much more vocal when it comes to criticizing Israel, but India doesn't do that. So India doesn't criticize Israel, but India says that the government supports the creation of a Palestinian state. And then if you look at India's position historically, it has evolved, right? India used to be a champion of the Palestinian cause during the Cold War. And then since 1990s, after India established a full diplomatic relationship with Israel, India always tries to balance between both sides. But even then, until 2015, India's position was that India supports the creation of an independent sovereign Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem being its capital. I'm saying 2015 because in 2015, President Pranab Mukherjee went to Israel, Jordan, and Ramallah. I covered his visit, and he repeated this position that India supports creation of a Palestinian state, and India specifies here the border, 1967 border, and India also specifies the capital, that East Jerusalem should be the capital of a future Palestinian state. But from 2015 onwards, the government of India doesn't refer to the border or the capital. So now what the government of India says is that India supports a just solution to the Palestinian crisis, or India supports a two-state solution, which means India supports the creation of a Palestinian state. But what should be the border? What should be the capital? What should be the status of the refugees? What should be the status of the settlers in the West Bank, etc., is up to the Israelis and the Palestinians to decide. This is how India's position has historically evolved. And in this particular context as well, you can't see any moral content in India's position. Rather, India has taken a realistic position of maintaining an equidistance from both sides, while at the same time saying, traditionally, this is our position, we support the creation of Palestine, but we are not willing to condemn Israel. So this is how India has balanced. Okay. And the second question, so I think Israel-Palestine is being discussed across the country. So yeah, people have, it's also a very polarized subject, right? Because I mean, if you look at the anecdotal issues on Twitter, you will see a lot of Israel fans in India, a lot of Israel fans. I mean, I have no problem with someone supporting a country. There is no, I mean, as long as you have facts on the ground, you're objective, it's fine. You can love a country. It's absolutely fine. But this is not like that. You know, Israel, as you mentioned, is some kind of a macho state. Israel is willing to use force, is ready to meet its objectives. So this narrative is there. But this narrative is this actually, you know, this defies the reality. Israel, when we understand Israel, yes, Israel is a country that achieved a lot ever since the country was created. There is no doubt about it. It's a country that was created after the Holocaust, you know, and it's a country created by the survivors and you know, those who fled Europe and came back. They built a country from the scratch. But at the same time, when we talk about Israel's military might, we should also understand that Israel is being protected by the United States, the world's most powerful country. And without the protection, diplomatic and military, political, financial protection of the United States, Israel cannot do what it is doing now. It is a nuclear country. It has nuclear weapons right from the 1960s. Nobody is talking about it. We have the whole global diplomatic machinery and military forces aimed at preventing Iran from going nuclear, right? Every time Iran enriches uranium, you have global headlines. IAEA wants to go to Iran, wants to inspect Iranian nuclear facilities, etc., etc. But Israel is the only nuclear weapons country in West Asia or the Middle East, whatever you would like to call it. So this nuclear monopoly which Israel has means a lot, and it is able to maintain that monopoly because it has the backing of the United States. And when Russia annexed Crimea, Russia was thrown out of G8, and you had sanctions on Russia. Israel has annexed East Jerusalem way back. In 1967, Israel captured East Jerusalem, and then later on annexed East Jerusalem. 1967, Israel annexed Golan Heights, and Israel captured Golan Heights, and thereafter Golan Heights have been annexed by the Israelis, which is recognized by the United States. The United States has recognized that Golan Heights is part of Israel, whereas the United Nations General Assembly resolutions, UN security resolutions clearly say that Golan Heights is a Syrian territory, right? So you should see this. And even after the war broke out, the October 7 war broke out, the United States has spent 17 billion, according to Brown University's latest study, $17.8 billion in terms of military assistance to Israel. So when Joe Biden calls for ceasefire, we should also understand that it is the Biden administration that is bankrolling this war. It's as simple as that. So Israel's that macho might is actually coming out of the support it enjoys from the United States. It's not an inherent thing that I think that many people do not understand. That we should factor that also in when we try to understand Israel's security and military policies.
Most of the beginning of this century has been defined by US's desire for control and power, and I guess that plays out in every single major war that we see. My question is about that, Stanley. How far are we from World War III, given that even Kamala Harris just said her biggest adversary is Iran? Obviously with the proxy war with Ukraine and Russia, Russia and Iran relations, and so on. Like there is clearly an axis on both sides. Are we one button away, or it is going to take a while to escalate?
So, with regard to Kamala Harris' statement, I watched the interview. I am not sure whether it is a slip or she actually believes Iran is the threat, because the Pentagon National Defense Strategy clearly, identifies China and Russia as the United States' biggest adversaries, and it clearly calls China as the only country that has the capabilities, that has the systemic capabilities to challenge the rules-based order. So Iran is
And
clearly not in the
I saw
picture.
your tweet on that, Stanley, saying, did she read the
Yeah.
document? I hope she read the document.
Yeah. I was surprised to hear the presidential candidate, the Democratic, and a sitting vice president, calling, while her own administration clearly identifies China as the systemic threat to the US. Anyway, coming to your question, but we can see, whether it would be a major regional war, a global war, etc., we have to see. But we can clearly say one thing, that the kind of security destruction we see on the global stage today, this has not happened in a long time. So there were conflicts in the past. There were localized conflicts, or there were proxy conflicts between superpowers. There were proxy conflicts between superpowers during the Cold War. And there were wars fought by the superpowers like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, or even the Soviet invasion of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, whatever. We can have enough examples about that. But what makes the current situation really difficult is that you have two major conflicts brewing in the world. One in the Eastern Europe between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And Russia is a major nuclear power, of course. And the Ukrainians are directly backed by NATO, the United States. And the United States is not willing to walk back. Russians are making incremental but steady progress, advances on the battlefield, which makes the situation far more dangerous, because you don't know what is going to happen. I don't see any practical off ramp from the Ukrainian war unless Ukraine agrees to give up territories at this point of time. And so that is one thing. And then secondly, if we look at West Asia here again, the crisis has only escalated. So I would like to call it a conflict loop in West Asia. And the only way to break out of the loop is escalation. That's how the regional players are looking at the conflict today. Because, in IR, we talk about this deterrence theory. Your nuclear missiles, your nuclear weapons are supposed to deter a second country from attacking you. But if you look at West Asia's conflict, nobody is deterring anybody. Israel's military might did not deter Hamas from launching the October 7 attack. Hamas still carried out the murderous, deadliest attack on October 7. And then, and again, Israel's military might did not stop Hezbollah from opening a support front. It did not prevent the Houthis from launching ballistic missiles and drones towards Israel. And Iran's support for all these proxies did not stop Israel from bombing the Iranian embassy in Damascus in April. And Israel's nuclear weapons, or the support it enjoys from the United States, did not stop the Iranians from launching a direct attack on Israel, not once but twice. First, they launched all these drones and cruise missiles, but their second attack was a devastating attack. So this is a serious situation here, because you see the complete collapse of the deterrence theory in West Asia today. Nobody is deterring anybody. And that is also the reason why the actors are escalating, because Israel wants to take the escalation dominance. So again, in IR, we will say the escalation dominance is that if one player thinks that escalation would help it achieve its objectives, it is ready to take higher risks. And Israel's military doctrine has always been like this. Israel wants to go ballistic. Israel doesn't want to show weakness. So in 1967, Israel went and bombed the Egyptian Air Force in one day. Massive bombing. So that's how Israel fights wars. So like Israel is carrying out the bombing of Lebanon today. So Israel wants to take the escalation dominance, but the Iranians are not letting Israel take the escalation dominance because Iran launched 180 ballistic missiles, and dozens of them actually hit Israel. The Navatim air base was hit by 34 ballistic missiles, apparently, according to independent studies. So Israel is not able to take escalation dominance. So you see the conflict in West Asia. This is a very dangerous situation. And Israel cannot afford to hit back because Israel doesn't want to show weakness. So Israelis are, at this point of time when we discuss this, Israelis are in discussion with the Americans on what should be their response to the Iranian attack. And the Iranians have clearly said that if Israel attacks us back, we are going to respond. So what are you going to get is a shooting match between the Iranians and the Israelis in West Asia. And Israel would, of course, like to draw the United States in, but the United States doesn't want to join the war because, the United States sees that its priorities are elsewhere. It doesn't want to get involved in another war in West Asia. But at the same time, the United States is not able to prevent the situation from escalating further. It is not ready to rein in the Israelis. So this is a very complex but dangerous situation. And what we are going to witness is only, at least in the short term, we are going to see is escalation. If you want to de-escalate the conflict, you should start from Gaza. You should have a ceasefire in Gaza. And then you should have a ceasefire in Lebanon. You should dial down the heat. I mean, simple. Everybody knows the solution. But no, Israel killed 28 people in Gaza today. And in Lebanon, there is a fierce battle is going on with the Israeli invasion of the country. So you are not going to see any de-escalation in the near future. So this is, and if the Americans are dragged into the war, if the US starts bombing Iranian sites, that will be completely catastrophic because Iran is, it is not just a continental West Asian continental country. It also sits at the Persian Gulf. It sits at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran has its own conventional and non-conventional capabilities. So nobody is a pushover here, right? So it is a very dangerous situation.
It is indeed, and I know it's quite late for you where you are in India, Stanley. So just sort of one final question for me, which is more about the hardware software part of this entire thing. I mean, Israel for long has been known, crudely put, as the snoop state. We've experienced it with Pegasus most recently, where there were amongst civil society leaders also journalists whose phones were allegedly tapped, and now you had this Pages episode, which was quite disturbing, even to watch and to see, because it wasn't just members of the Hezbollah; it was also people working in medical facilities who were grievously injured. What do you think this does to the trajectory of fighting these tech wars in the months to come, both in terms of the level of sophistication with the software, but also the more crude approach of the hardware?
Yeah. So in the case of Lebanon, where the pages exploded, I mean, we have only limited facts about it. I mean, we all know that the Israelis were behind it, of course. They haven't denied their involvement in it. But the Israelis had set up a frontal organization. Mossad had set up a frontal organization apparently in Budapest. And this organization started licensing the pages built by Apollo Gold, which is a Taiwanese company. And then they started supplying these devices to other clients. So it is a years-long operation. So Israel has clearly weaponized your personal tech here, right? This is something which a terrorist organization does. There is no doubt about it. And also the way these pages were exploded. So I know you can see that many people, including Piers Morgan, etc., they say that this was a targeted, pinpointed attack at Hezbollah terrorists. But you never know who's using the pager, right? You never know where whether this person is in a supermarket, driving a car, or on a train. Uh, you don't know whether kids are around. Actually, kids were also killed in the explosions. So this is clearly weaponization of personal tech. And after this, I think Emirates has already banned pages on board. This happened last week. So this will have lasting, I think, impact on the security front. What happened? This also opened all kind of opportunities, because what you witnessed was the supply side intrusion by the Israeli state in personal tech. So who is going to do this next? And you never know. There were all kind of conspiracy theories as well after this happened, after the pages exploded about the killing of about the death of the Iranian president. So all kind of conspiracy theories were there in Iranian social media after the pages exploded. So clearly you see, you see the weaponization of personal technology. And when it comes to these things, as you mentioned earlier, Israel, the whole Pegasus episode, we can talk about it. It became a big issue everywhere in democracies, in autocracies, including in India. But did you see any meaningful action against NSO? NSO was the company's name. Nothing, no? Was there any global sanction against the company? There was nothing. Any criticism from European capitals? Because Europe, when it comes to these things, Europe is, I mean, usually very active, very vibrant, right? If it is a Russian or an Iranian or a Chinese hack, it should be. It was supposed to be a big issue, but here you don't see any response. So Israel has a history of using this kind of technology, whether it is breaching your security or using it for intelligence purposes. And then here, what you witnessed was the weaponization of the personal technology, which I think can have lasting implications for security, travel, and also the fight against terrorism and also for terrorists.
Stanley, I have so many questions and I could go on forever, but I think I'm very wary of the idea that you are in your office so late, so I really don't want to keep going. But I'm super grateful for all of the insights that you've offered so far, and I think we might come back to you to continue this discussion, especially in terms of different facets of all of the proxy wars that are going on and how this plays out. Um, for now, I'd love to go to Have You Heard? As we were saying to you before, it's a segment where we talk about something light, something different. Not necessarily always from the news, but news is welcome. You are also welcome to self-promote if there is anything on your mind. Um, um, Mitali, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, I was going to say maybe, in the course of this conversation, Stanley may have thought of writing another book. So he could add that in his Have You Heard? But Ruchir, why don't you go first? What's the Have You Heard on your mind this week?
Um, you know, obviously, like we're all students of politics, and US politics right now captures everyone's headlines. Um, Interestingly, crypto has become mainstream in US politics, and I don't mean, Donald Trump's interest in Bitcoin. I mean this website called Polymarket. It's become the go-to place for folks interested in U.S. elections and U.S. politics to see what's going on, where the winds are, what direction the winds are blowing. Poly Market is basically a crypto marketplace built on top of uh, something called Ethereum, and there you can place a bet on anything. And by anything, I mean, as long as there's enough interest, you can create your own bet and place a bet as long as there is somebody willing to take the other side. But what has become mainstream is every single state and how the elections will go in each of the states in the US, and obviously where the presidential election will land. So instead of just watching the polling, from Nate Silver. I've also been watching Polymarket and seeing where the betting markets are in the US. So that's been a really interesting way to learn about US elections and the likely outcomes. Polymarket, if you haven't checked it out yet.
Sounds very cool. Maybe I can go next, so it gives Stanley a little bit of time to sort of plan his Have You Heard. I'm actually doing a Ruchir and talking tech, which is wholly unfamiliar to me, but there's a really cool news platform called 404 Media. I don't know if people who are listening track their work, but they do some really fantastic stories. And they came out with such an interesting story only recently. I think it was yesterday, where basically they're doing a deep dive on how people are using AI to start sort of auto applying for jobs. So it's called the AI Hawk, I think, one of the many apps. And there was one of their own team members attempted it, and as he explains, by breakfast he had applied for 12 jobs across the across the United States. Essentially what this does is that it just trawls LinkedIn and all these other sort of professional sites, picks up a lot of information, auto generates a description, and sends it out to the world. And there was someone, I think, that they interviewed who had applied through AI for 2,843 jobs. So, if you think that this is a pain, imagine the side of the employer who is going through this thinking, I'm not sure what that is, but it doesn't quite add up. So it's quite insane, really, what's happening with AI. Stanley, your turn.
Yeah, since you talked about books, I think that's my comfortable territory as well. So I was actually working on a book on Israel Palestine.
Is this a
So,
big reveal? Is
so I
our
started
podcast
with,
a big reveal? Oh my God, how exciting!
yeah. So started working on it after the Hamas attack, the October 7 attack, and our plan was to release the book on October 7, 2024. So the book is done. The book is done. It was all done. Editing, everything is done. But then, again, you see dramatic changes in the region, especially after the killing of Nasrallah and Israel expanding the war towards Lebanon and Iran getting involved with much more force. So we thought that we will update at least parts of the book. And then, so that's why it got a bit delayed. But the book is going to be out in November, by mid November. So within a few
You
That's
have a
months.
name yet?
exciting.
I
Do,
have a
do, do,
name.
do
Yeah.
we have a name?
I
Yeah.
will announce it. Yeah, we have a name. Yeah, it's there. I mean, everything is finalized. But yeah, I will announce the name maybe after a couple of weeks.
Amazing,
All
very
right.
exciting. And can I say I sort of feel your pain. I'm only one book old. You're a veteran in this field, Stanley. But I don't know why I chose the topic of crypto. And every time I would hit finish, there would be another story
Yeah,
that would blow up, and I'd be like, oh my
I know,
God,
I know, I know.
really?
And yeah, and writing is not easy, as you
No,
all know. It's very tough, no? It's a painful process, but
it
yeah,
is.
but still, it gives you some joy once
I
you are
think
done
it
with
is.
your
Yeah, I
writing.
think it's
Yeah,
also a space for you
It,
to sort of share so much of your knowledge, which is amazing, Stanley.
yeah. Thank you.
I suppose one of the takeaways is avoid writing books about wars and crypto. You never end.
Yeah,
Thank
Entrepreneurship,
you,
that could also be
Stanley, so much again for joining
a
and
topic.
educating us about West Asia and everything that's going on. I realize it's a complex story and it continues. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here. As always, thank you, Mitali. You can find us all on Twitter and tell us what you think. We are TID underscore dialogue or TID underscore podcast. I'm sorry. Mitali is at Mitali Live. Stanley is at John Stanley. I am Ruchir underscore P. You can write to us at India Dialogue Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you again for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.